My name is Cheryl Snay. I'm the curator of European and American art before 1900 here at the Rachlin Murphy Museum. I want to thank you all for coming here to the second of our 3 lecture series. Next Wednesday at 5:30, same time, same place, but next week, we will have the last one in the series. That is going to be given by Logan Sisley, who is the head curator at the Hugh Lane Gallery. So we are very fortunate to have someone from the National Gallery of Ireland, and then next week from the Hugh Lane Gallery. We've got all of our bases covered. If you haven't already seen the exhibition, which I hope you have, or if you want to come back again, we are open late on Thursday evenings until 7:30. And we are open on the weekends from noon to 5 p.m., so there's lots of time to come back in and see the show if you haven't already, or if you want to do it again. And I do have to make one little calendar note. We will be closed for Thanksgiving holiday, so that Thanksgiving Thursday and the Friday after Thanksgiving, we will be closed, but we'll be open on Saturday and Sunday, so you're welcome to bring your guests in on Saturday and Sunday. We have lots of programs organized around the Walter Osborne exhibition, so please check our website for all of the other programs that our educators have put together for us. It is very robust. This is the last lecture in the series, and I really am very pleased to welcome Dr. Brendan Rooney back to campus. Dr. Rooney visited us first in 2019 when we organized the exhibition Looking at the Stars, Irish Art at the University of Notre Dame to celebrate the gift of Irish paintings from the Donald and Marilyn Keogh collection. Since then, we've remained in contact, and when the prospects of a Walter Osborne exhibition strengthened a few years ago, he was among the first people that I contacted, since the National Gallery of Ireland is a rich repository of Osborne's works. He's been very generous with his time and in opening up the NGI's vaults and archives for further study. We are very fortunate to have secured the loans of 14 works, which now grace the walls of our temporary exhibition gallery. Chief among these loans is the portrait of Mary Guinness and her daughter Margaret, which was a very recent heritage gift to the National Gallery and the subject of a focus exhibition there organized by none other than Dr. Rooney. Thank you, Brendan, for all of your help with all of the logistics and making this exhibition possible, and especially for allowing us to bring the Guinness Portrait here for an American debut. I know she's a favorite among your Irish visitors, and that she is sorely missed in Dublin right now. Dr. Rooney earned his Ph.D. from Trinity College, Dublin, and is the head curator and curator of Irish art at the National Gallery of Ireland. In his capacity there, he has written and edited many books and exhibition catalogues on Irish art, chief among them Creating History, Stories of Ireland in Art, published in 2016. He's organized exhibitions of the work of Irish painters, including Roderic O'Conor, John Lavery, and Jack B. Yeats. He's currently working on a monographic study of 18th century painter Nathaniel Hone, in addition to researching the careers of Evie Hone and Mainie Jellett. He's also responsible for the National Portrait Collection and sits on the Board of Trustees of the National Self-Portrait Collection at the University of Limerick. So there is likely no one more qualified to discuss Walter Osborne's tonight, and his presentation is entitled All the Reality of Life, Osborne, People, and Portraiture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rooney.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's a real treat to be back in Notre Dame. It's been a while. A certain thing called COVID happened in the meantime, so it feels like a different world now. It's terrific to be back, and I'd like to thank Cheryl and her colleagues here at the Rachlin Murphy, and particularly Judith Stapleton, who isn't here this evening, unfortunately, and Aoife Marie, who is formerly of my parish in the National Gallery of Ireland, so it's wonderful. And my interest in Walter Osborne has never waned, and if anything, my affection for him has been increased by the exhibition upstairs, so it's wonderful to see it here showcased in America. I thought I might start by showing you two photographs of Walter Osborne. One, as he was perceived by many people in the final years of his life on the left-hand side, and another which is really closer to how he perceived himself. These images are complementary rather than contradictory. On the left, he appears as the established portrait painter to Ireland's medical, legal, academic, and clerical elite. And on the right, he appears in rather less formal circumstances, outdoors with one of his friends, a man called P.M. Crosthwaite. Both these images reveal facets of Osborne's personality that informed his work, his artistic work, throughout his life. A sense of discipline and decorum, suggested by the image on the left, and as was demanded by formal portraiture, and a perhaps unlikely casualness by the picture on the right, which is consistent with his love of nature and his inclination to paint outdoors, en plein air, as we say. He was remembered by those who knew him as a figure of unusual sensitivity, who was really attuned to the characteristics and the character of the subjects that he chose to paint. Osborne was introduced early to the notion of character in subjects through the work of his father, who was an artist of considerable renown in his own right. His name was William Osborne, and he was a specialist animal painter whose portraits of dogs, exemplified by the picture you see on the left, anthropomorphized his subjects in a way that appealed very much to a particular sentimental middle-class audience. He produced a large number of these. He was particularly gifted at painting dogs, and they often had these narrative, suggestive titles indicating that they were kind of behaving and interacting with each other in a particular way. When it came to painting people and producing portraits of people, William was really not quite as skilled. He often painted figures on horseback, and they were very stiff by comparison with his dogs. In fact, borderline cadaverous half the time. I chose not to show you any of those. So Walter learned a lot from his father. They studied together, they painted in Dublin Zoo together on occasion, and Walter became an extremely accomplished painter of animals. But as you'll see in the picture on the right-hand side, he began to introduce people increasingly into his images of this kind, and often children interacting with children. So there were vestiges or echoes of his father's work in the pictures like that on the right that you see, but increasingly they became more distinctively Walter's own. Osborne's gradual move away from this sentimental kind of painting towards work with greater veracity, with greater sense of reality, was encouraged at the Royal Academy of Fine Art in Antwerp, where he studied first, having left Dublin. There, as illustrated by these two works, one by an artist called Dermot O'Brien, which you see on the left-hand side, and another by Osborne's great friend Nathaniel Hone on the right-hand side. These typify the approach. So a man called Charles Verlat, who was this very famous teacher at the Royal Academy of Fine Art, encourages students to work directly from the clothed model, exactly as you see on the left-hand side, with a view to incorporating these figures into fully realized paintings, as you see on the right-hand side. So these are differing in date, but the principle remains the same, that idea of preparing through your work as a student and your sketching as a student for work that you would ultimately produce into large exhibitable portraits. More influential still than his experience in Antwerp on the cultivation of Osborne's sophisticated ability and inclination to capture the character of children specifically, which would become a constant in his work and which you see in the exhibition upstairs, was the naturalist painting to which he was introduced subsequently in France, having left Belgium. Osborne was temperamentally disposed towards naturalism, or rustic naturalism as it's sometimes known, and in particular the artistic concerns of its lodestar, a man called Jules Bastien-Lepage, one of whose paintings you see on the left-hand side. Bastien-Lepage's influence around Europe and beyond was rapid, profound, and widespread, reaching through the 1880s and into the 1890s as far afield as Eastern Europe, North America, if you think of artists like Thomas Eakins, for instance, and even as far as Japan. Unlike Impressionism, which was taking place, or a phenomenon at the same time, naturalism was international. Impressionism during its own immediate life really stayed within France, but naturalism spread rapidly under the influence of Bastien Lepage. One artist, or one critic, I should say, sorry, in almost an exasperation in 1883, said in reference to the influence of Bastien Lepage, "The whole world paints today so much like Monsieur Bastien Lepage, that Monsieur Bastien Lepage seems to paint like the whole world." Like the realist painting from which it evolved, naturalism elevated the ordinary, assigning to the everyday activities of agricultural laborers and urban dwellers alike a monumentality that was previously reserved for grand history painting. So these were often very large pictures. Naturalist painters combined this sense of purpose with a preoccupation with tone rather than color, and with the manipulation of space that was redolent of contemporary photography, and many of them, including Walter Osborne, used contemporary photography. Osborne absorbed all of this, and his debt to Bastien Lepage, who died suddenly in 1884, was manifest in his final paintings, though many of these were much smaller than the works by Bastien Lepage, but you'll see examples of it upstairs as well. But it was also manifest in his desire to spread the gospel, if you like, to disseminate Bastien Lepage's influence himself. Meticulous in orders in all his affairs, Osborne did something that we probably all aspire to do but never get around to doing, which is to record what we lend to people. On the right-hand side is Osborne's diary from 1892, in which he lists not just the items themselves and who he lent them to, these were books and things, but also when he lent them and whether he got them back or not. So here you see that from April to June 1892, he lent Life of Lepage, which was a biography of Bastien Lepage that had been translated into English just that year, to his friends Joseph Malachy Kavanagh and Nathaniel Hill. And you can see by the fact that they're crossed off that they both rather advisedly gave them back. Bastien Lepage's Bastien Lepage's interest in both young and old characters inspired many works by his followers. Pamesh, the picture that you see on the left, is derived from the phrase Il n'y a pamesh, which translates loosely as nothing doing. This title and the young boy's relaxed stance suggest perhaps infant inactivity or indolence, were it not for the pictorial references to his occupation. The whip in his hand, the long horn over his shoulder, and the dirty worker's boots he wears indicate that this is a barge boy, whose job it was to control the horses that pulled barges along the French canals. This, critically, is a working child with responsibility and agency, interrupted in the course of his working day. It's possible that Osborne saw this particular painting when it was on show at the London premises of Archer Tooth and Sons, who were art dealers in London, in 1882, but there were many other works of this kind by Bastien Lepage that he could have seen. In addressing children's character in the way that Bastien Lepage does here, he was responding to or reflecting an increasing interest among educators, philanthropists, psychologists, journalists, and others on the intellectual, emotional, and psychological independence of children, on their vulnerability and on their rights. This was really quite radical thinking. This was clear in the reform of the education system. So mandatory education for children was introduced in England in 1872 and in France in 1882. It was clear from changes in legislation and in a general change in people's perceptions of what childhood was as a phenomenon. John Thomas Barnes' before and after photographs that you see here that he produced for the philanthropist Thomas Barnardo, two of which you see on the screen, it's two of many, argued for the effectiveness of charitable intervention in the changing of the fortunes of destitute children. So the idea being that if you put them into care and resourced the care, children could go from the state that you see the child in on the left to the state that you see on the right. It excited much debate in the 1870s in England and proved powerful instruments in the campaign for greater protection for children in London and beyond. In these photographs, Barnes placed real children, the little boy on the left is a genuine child who had been taken off the streets of London, in the relatively contrived surroundings of a photographer's studio. Irish artist Richard Thomas Moynihan, who was a close contemporary of Walter Osborne and also trained in Antwerp, would do the same thing in his large painting, Military Manoeuvres, which you see on the screen and which is one of the most popular pictures in the National Gallery of Ireland, drawing the models from his children from a Dublin orphanage of which he was a patron. However, though he did so largely in an attempt at authenticity of the kind I mentioned earlier, he struggled to eliminate entirely from his picture the sentimentality that had dogged the depiction of children in academic painting for a long time. There's a definite performative, sort of theatrical quality to this picture. Osborne and others among those followers of Bastien Lepage were more rigorous in their efforts to avoid this kind of mawkishness, representing their child subjects increasingly as complex individuals inhabiting their own material, emotional, and social worlds. This is demonstrated by both the work you see on the left by an artist called Mary Bashkirtsev, who is a disciple of Bastien Lepage's and a great friend of his, and in the small painting on the right by Walter Osborne called A Tale of the Sea. Both subjects, one French, the other English, are examinations of childhood, and more specifically of impromptu interactions during work and play. Both pictures eschew the theatrical model on which academic narrative painting was so often based, in which the protagonists face outwards as if they're on a stage performing for an audience. Here, by contrast, the actors look inwards towards each other, as people do, naturally, as children would do. And in the case of three of them, they've turned their backs to us entirely, emphasizing the introspective nature of their interactions. This is quite unusual. So if you think about a classic presentation of a painting of, say, or even on television when people are placed around a table in dialogue with each other, they're all facing you so that you can see them all. It was quite unusual to do this, and you'll see in the exhibition upstairs how many characters have their back to you. It's very deliberate on his part. Demonstrating a keen appreciation of these changes in the understanding of children and their lived experience, Osborne returned repeatedly in his work to their independent internal and external worlds. And it's interesting to note throughout his work, and he was very prolific, that his children rarely look directly out of the canvas. They're occupying their own worlds within them. There are conspicuous exceptions, but generally speaking, they're not looking directly outwards. As a consequence, he routinely captured children in various states, from reverie, exemplified by these two pictures, where you have these two young girls in a moment of thought, or gentle recreation, as you see in this watercolor of two girls building a house of cards. You have disappointment as well in this painting called Forbidden Fruit, in which one of the boys is transfixed by the one thing he can't have, under close observation of the woman in the background who is ready and armed with a brush should he choose to disappoint her. To resignation. In this case, a little boy sitting in Dublin's St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was a rich quarry of subject matter for Osborne, resigned to the fact that his grandmother, or perhaps his governess, has fallen asleep entirely beside him. This could be a long afternoon for this little boy. Osborne's A Boy Blowing Bubbles, which you see on the left, an exploration of childhood wonder, exemplifies his approach to depiction of children and provides a striking and, in this case, I'd argue, deliberate counterpoint to the more saccharine and romanticized contemporary representation of children. Various details in Osborne's picture on the left, the clay pipe, the bowl, the boy's pose, and the direction of his gaze, indicate that Osborne was referencing very deliberately John Everett Millais' celebrated painting Bubbles, which you see on the right-hand side, which was purchased by the chairman of Pear's Soap in London in 1886, and we're led to believe, and there may be challenges from the audience, that's fine, was the first occasion in which fine art had been used in advertising. And some of you may recognize it from this. This is, I mean, you talk about art being chocolate boxy. This is your classic Well, this is soapbox instead, but it is a very, very well-known and often reproduced image. Rather than a homage to that picture, which, as I say, dates from 1886, Osborne's equivalent represents, if anything, an attempt to reclaim the subject and perhaps assert the reality of childhood. Whereas Millet's painting, derived from 17th century Dutch art, features period costume and a moral subtext, in this case the bubble representing the brevity of childhood, or even more dramatically or melodramatically, life. Osborne's picture, set emphatically in the artist's studio, is matter-of-fact. It's a matter-of-fact representation of childhood wonder. To suggest that Osborne's depiction of children, like this one, was empirical, however, is not to propose that the artist presented children as sociological types or ciphers devoid of personality. Indeed, the success of his scenes of children in everyday life, no less than in formal portraiture, relied on his familiarity and engagement with his subjects. I should say, I wasn't necessarily going to point this out, but this picture on the left-hand side, feeding the chickens, has a special place in my heart because I included it in a lecture many years ago, and when the floor was open to questions at the end, a lady put her hand up and I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be a Walter Osborne. I've mugged up, I'm ready for this. And she said, I think that chicken's too big. And I said, drawing on my very limited knowledge of the size of fowl, I said, well, I'll have to do some research on that. Now, she's never come back to me. This was years ago. I'm hoping she never does. I still don't know if the chicken beside this little girl is too big, but maybe you can ponder that as you consider it. But in relation to this picture, in a letter to his father, William, which you see on the right, this illustrated letter, of which Osborne produced many, Osborne mentions the model for this painting and the challenging circumstances in which the picture was produced. The weather, I'm sorry to say, he wrote, has been bitterly cold the last week, so much so that my model nearly fainted. I had to send her home. It will probably seem funny to you all that her name should be Bessie Osborne. And Stotts, that's Edward Stott, his friend, the fellow with Nathaniel Hone and I, Annie Osborne. They are no relations, as you might think, but merely form two in about a list of 20 people of that aristocratic name. The human connection that that letter suggests was consistently communicated through Osborne's studies and portraits of children, though contemporary critics seem disinclined to acknowledge or appreciate it. Assessing the thorn bush, the painting you see on the screen, for example, Thomas Bodkin admired the inextricable tangle of weeds and grasses, but neglected to comment at all on Osborne's inclusion of the goatherd and his little sister who clings to his side. The absence of these figures from the study that you see on the left, which is a general study rather than a specific preparatory study for this work, wonderful in its own right, by the way, in its freshness, illustrates how key the children's understated presence was to the overall atmosphere and success of the larger finished work. Many observers, including some of Osborne's friends and champions, were afflicted by a similar kind of short-sightedness when it came to discussing the qualities of his portraiture, often distracted by the fashions of the haute monde or the somber authority of professional men who populated his portraits. They preferred to focus on Osborne's technical virtuosity than on his emotional insights, which I think he really did have. Reviews of both Irish and British exhibitions in which Osborne contributed spoke of his exceptional abilities in capturing reliable likenesses, images of people who looked like the people that they were portraits of, and to the various qualities of light and texture. His psychological insights, attributable to a lifetime of people watching, which is emphatically expressed in the exhibition upstairs, excited comparatively less interest. Osborne's interest in child subjects was complemented by a curiosity about older characters, exemplified by this work from the exhibition of elderly gentlemen assembled in Marsh's library in Dublin. And he regularly sought out opportunities to place young and old side by side. This was an established practice, particularly for those artists who traveled to provincial France at the end of the 19th century. In regions like Brittany, where Osborne spent a considerable amount of time, following his departure from Belgium. Older people were widely seen by visitors to those regions as guardians of tradition, if you like, while children represented or symbolized the future, but also the preservation of those traditions. There was also a more banal reason for this bringing together of generations. Among working populations, particularly rural populations and those in coastal areas, adults of working age were often absent during the times of the day when the light was best and artists were most active. Elderly people, as a consequence, were more visible, more available as models, and often more likely to be looking after their grandchildren while those children's parents were away, often at sea or on the land. Even Osborne's own folio of photographs, which you see an example of here behind me, testifies to the equivalence or complementary quality Osborne himself saw in these stages of life. Here, arranged deliberately side by side, are a photograph of an elderly Breton man wearing traditional Breton sabots, these wooden clogs that were favored by people in the region at the time. And beside him, a photograph of a little girl dressed in a similarly distinctive Breton coif, this very distinctive white headdress. Opportunities to juxtapose old and young in this way present themselves to Osborne in a variety of settings. From coastal areas or villages close to the sea like this one. This is in Rye in Sussex, which is clearly recognizable from the RX on the bow of the boat, the R standing for Rye and the X standing for Sussex. So that was the standard practice of registering boats at the time. And also in Dublin streets, I should have pointed out that you see down in the bottom foreground this grandmother, or maybe even great-grandmother, looking after these children while they await the ferry that's going to take them home. This kind of juxtaposition of generations is also obvious in this picture that's in the exhibition upstairs. Dublin streets are vendor of books, in which a little girl tries to sell daffodils to men who are much more interested in reading at this bookseller's stall. They seem oblivious to her presence, unlike her mother, who looks on, making sure that she's making some sales beside her. And on the right-hand side, in Life in Connemara, again, you see the same theme of figures, of older figures and younger people together, in this case in the Connemara village, which is of a kind that one critic said provided Osborne with refreshment from the toils of actually trying to produce formal portraiture. And then in a Dublin park, Light and Shade, which again is in the exhibition upstairs, Osborne presents us with an especially poignant juxtaposition of youth and old age. The composition masquerades as a moment of happenstance, a chance meeting. But we know from associated sketches, from an oil painting of the same mother and baby that's upstairs, and also an alternative view of the same figures on a park bench in St. Stephen's Green, that Osborne identified this particular arrangement of figures as resonant and placed them together as figures that had particular pictorial potential in their own right. It's also important to note that Osborne's interest in such subjects was not undermined or diminished by the stylistic evolution of his work. As you'll see from the exhibition, and I'm sure most of you have been there already, the change in his work is very clear. So here he's become much more concerned with fleeting events of the fleeting effects of light, rather than that more tonal effect you see in the earlier pictures. And you also see this inclination in Osborne's At the Breakfast Table, the centerpiece of the exhibition upstairs. Though it's interesting to note that little Violet in her high chair, unlike many of the children we've seen in earlier pictures, is looking directly out of the canvas, but I'll get back to that in a little while. In his portrait practice, of course, Osborne faced the considerable challenge of painting children in a more negotiated context, often in the company of older members of their families. Patrons with their own particular tastes and opinions on how they should be represented routinely exercised control over portrait painters when it came to the scale and composition of portraits, but also the specific manner in which they would carry themselves. This is understandable. If you're investing quite a lot of money in a portrait, you'll want to exercise or effect as much control over the way you appear as you possibly can. The creative challenge for painters then, and Osborne among them, was in identifying subtle and intangible qualities that transcended the often prescribed nature of what they were actually producing. Osborne's portrait of May Guinness and her daughter Margaret that you see here served many functions. It was a record of social position. It was a testament to refined taste and high fashion, but it was also a celebration of motherhood and family. It also represented an opportunity for Osborne to demonstrate his technical ability in handling light, rendering textures, and in balancing composition on a large scale. It's a big, big picture. And it also demonstrated his ability, again, in capturing character. This is simultaneously a portrait of Mrs. Noel Guinness and her daughter, as it was exhibited in its own time. It's a portrait of Mary and Margaret Guinness, which was actually their names, and one of the challenges that curators face now is rehabilitating pictures like this and, in some cases, re-identifying the people within them. Mary and Margaret were both individuals in their own right, and the mother was a person of particular significance. But they're also Moll and Molly, which were the names that they were known by in their home. The finished painting is a tour de force of technical ability, based, as you see here, on careful preparation, but also a remarkably sensitive record of the bond between a mother and her 3-year-old daughter. So these are 2 preparatory studies for that larger picture, which shows the effort that was invested in producing them. The stakes were high when it came to society portraits of this kind, and not all proved as successful as the Guinness portrait you've just seen. Osborne's large portrait of Grace Jemison and her daughter Violet is just as imposing as the Guinness portrait in scale, at any rate, but is decidedly colder. The physical distance between the mother and her daughter here contributes significantly to this. But there's a distinct stiffness and reserve to the portrait that suggests that other factors were at play. It does seem that the circumstances in which this painting was produced were particularly austere and extended to the nailing of little Violet's shoes to the floor to make sure that she didn't move while she was posing. The fact that she would become in due course a violin soloist of some distinction might indicate why the parents thought it was so important to present her in this particular guise. But you can imagine how difficult it must have been for her to pose playing a musical instrument. The portrait was not without its merits, however, or its admirers, and as this photograph records, it was placed prominently in the memorial exhibition at the Royal Hibernian Academy after Osborne's death in 1903. So you see it very prominently on the wall. And this photograph also features at the breakfast table and several other pictures that are upstairs. So it's wonderful to be able to see. Actually, it also has the large picture 2 down, which is in the exhibition upstairs. It's possible that the Jemisons were simply not as receptive to the natural conviviality on which Osborne relied in his interactions with his patrons. His sumptuous portrait of Dorothy and Irene Faulkner, which you see here, delighted these little girls' mother, Henrietta, not least because it far exceeded the sketch that she had commissioned Osborne to produce for the relatively modest sum of £50. It is a big picture, much more elaborate than what she'd actually asked for. In her unpublished memoirs, the mother, Henrietta, records in some detail not just her great satisfaction with the finished picture, but her admiration for the artist and his methods. The picture's success, she suggests, was attributable at least in part to Osborne's insistence that she could not see it until it was finished, as you see from the text here. Instead, he received the little girls at his studio with their governess twice a week and wouldn't let the mother see it at all. On the strength of that portrait, Caesar Faulkner, the little girl's father, approached Osborne to produce a full-length portrait of his wife, Henrietta, who had made those notes. And she recalled that while she and her husband, again, were not allowed to see the painting that you see on the right while it was in production, Osborne used to ask the 2 little girls
Dorothy and Irene to look at it, as it was his view that children were often the cleverest critics. Whether or not the girls' opinions were decisive, we don't know, but Osborne was dissatisfied with the original version of the painting and in response cut the head off and repainted it, having asked Henrietta to sit again. The final version, which you see on the right and is in the National Gallery in Dublin, proved more successful and was hung at the Royal Academy in London in 1902. There it convinced the critic for the Evening Mail, which was a newspaper with quite considerable circulation, that Osborne was a man who knows what a painting is, and who, when he sets to work to make a portrait of a lady, neither runs into mere sentiment or mere decoration, nor contents himself with plain prose. Great praise, high praise indeed. These grand portraits are neither objective nor unmediated and did allow for considerable artistic license. Osborne's own reference photograph rather gives this one away, as it suggests that the experience of posing was not quite as agreeable an experience for Dorothy and Irene as their mother remembered. Any of us with children will recognize the look on the child's face on the right-hand side. Whereas in the painting, the finished painting, a slightly coy Dorothy looks out contentedly with a little doll in her hand. In the photograph on the right, she cuts a decidedly glum figure, clinging tightly to her big sister's coattails. Everything about the look on her face says, really? Do we still have to be here? Omitting this detail of her clinging onto her sister's coattails is perhaps a curious edit, as Osborne employed the very same nervous mannerism to good effect in his portrait of Molly Nutting, which you see upstairs in the exhibition. In the painting, Molly grabs a fistful of her satin dress, suggesting at once the unease of posing, but also suggesting that perhaps she wanted to show off her shoes. Osborne was acutely sensitive to the power of these subtle gestures and was particularly judicious in the placement of hands. This was no minor undertaking, and painting hands required patience and considerable skill. In his book, The Art of Portrait Painting, published in 1906, the English portrait specialist John Collier argued that as a hand is in some ways more difficult to paint than a head, an artist should be prepared, if necessary, to give more time to the former than to the latter. Now, I don't really know if he believed that. I don't know if I believe it, but it is true that many artists, many portrait painters, hid hands in their portraits. And I hope now that I've said it, you'll notice next time you're in a museum looking at portraits, you'll see people put their hands inside their jackets, behind their backs, and it's because hands are extremely challenging to paint, but they're also very expressive. In the portrait of the Guinnesses, which you see on the right again, Margaret's hand resting gently on the nape of her mother's neck completes a compositional rectangle around their heads, connecting the pair both physically and compositionally. In a similar way, Elizabeth Chadwick Healy, whose portrait you see on the left, takes her mother's hand, introducing a real tenderness to a portrait which could otherwise be consumed in opulence. Osborne employed the same device in At the Breakfast Table, as I said, the picture from the Rachel Murphy's own collection and the centerpiece of the exhibition upstairs. He places little Violet's hand in close proximity to the hand of her grandmother. It's a deeply personal picture in which no detail is incidental, not the lighting, the setting, or the arrangement of the figures. Equally judicious is the placement of the chair in the foreground, this almost clumsy placement of the chair, which recalls Gustav Caillebott's painting Luncheon of 1876, which you see on the right. There, in rather more opulent Parisian surroundings and to a rather different effect, the artist places the viewer at the table, so all of us are the person occupying that seat in front of the plate. But you're in the seat left vacant by the artist's father, who had died 2 years previously. While I don't want to be too categorical in making a connection between Caillebott's painting and Osborne's, it does strike me as interesting that on the evidence of the associated letter to William Stockley, which you see here, so written to the little girl's father, and the engaging stare of the child directly out of the picture, which was unusual for Osborne, The painting was executed with little Violet's father very much in mind. In the foreground, the back of the chair obscures a table setting. This is most obviously Walter's seat. He is, after all, the artist who's observing it. But it could also represent a place for Violet's absent father, William, or perhaps even by extension, her deceased mother. There were, in short, conspicuously empty seats at the Osborne's dining table. And we shouldn't underestimate Osborne's closeness to his family, which he expressed in word and deed, and also powerfully in the portraits that he produced of his parents and his siblings. So these are his father, mother, brother, and sister. But they don't come across as formal portraits of them, but rather as Ga, Mudi, Cha, and Vai, as they were known within the family. Walter's unexpected death in 1903 at the age of 44 compounded the heartache experienced by the family with the death of Violet 10 years earlier. That's Violet Sr., his sister, and William in 1901. Charles, his brother, was so devastated by Walter's death that when Dermot O'Brien inquired as to what he should do with all the paintings that remained in Walter's, there were 1,500 paintings remaining in his studio after his death, Charles replied simply, burn them all. There's a similar immediacy and sensitivity in Osborne's depiction of his friends, among them Stephen Gwynne, which I know Katie spoke about very expertly in the last lecture, and also of his friends and associates like Nellie O'Brien, the pastel of whom you see on the left-hand side, with who she was the person with whom Osborne was believed to be romantically involved, if not engaged. Osborne produced at least 2 portraits of Nellie, who was the sister of his friend Dermot O'Brien, who I mentioned earlier. As you can see, both of these, like other portraits of his friends and allies, boast a quiet self-possession, which was a phrase identified in Osborne's work, or a quality identified in Osborne's work by one of his critics. Just as a sidebar, I might mention that Osborne's relationship with Nellie, believed to have been ended abruptly at his death, was not his only romantic misadventure. He was understood to have been preparing to propose to the sister of the great artist William Orpen. She can be seen second from right in the painting. After her return from a trip to Norway, which she was making with her father in an attempt to distract her from another rather unsuccessful romantic experience. But on the way home to Dublin, to the picnic with Walter, she bumped into a London-based solicitor who she promptly became engaged to. So poor Walter never got to propose. But to return to Osborne's depiction of his friends, his portrait of Walter Osborne, erstwhile director of the National Gallery of Ireland, which you see on the right, is a testament to Osborne's versatility and ability to transcend the oppressive austerity that dogged formal portraiture of this kind. Though the palette dominated by earth tones and inky blacks is fairly orthodox or conventional, it's relieved by subtle accents of color and detail, and even more so by the open expression of its subject with its distinct suggestion of recognition. He was a close friend of Walter Osborne's, with whom Osborne had traveled to the Netherlands, Spain, and France in recent years. The comparatively small portrait on the left of another close friend, the artist and inventor J.S. McIlwain, points to the evolution of Osborne's style and technique, which we saw earlier as well, and demonstrates Osborne's ability to capture the essence of character in a wholly different idiom. The quality of this work was not lost on other artists, among them the above-mentioned William Orpen, whose virtuoso picture, The Mirror, that you see on the right-hand side, was produced when Orpen was just 22. Orpen had previously been a student at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art when Osborne was teaching there, and would in turn establish himself as one of the most sought-after portrait painters in Ireland and Britain in the early decades of the 20th century. Osborne would no doubt have been gratified by his friend Stephen Gwynne's description of early portraits by Orpen as being typically, quote, as like an Osborne as he could make them. But Osborne would have been perhaps even more satisfied by the endorsement of Orpen himself. When Hugh Lane was assembling artworks for inclusion in his Guildhall exhibition of Irish art in 1904, Orpen, who was not given to idle praise, wrote, "Have you got Osborne's McIlwain," this picture on the left-hand side, have it at any cost. The portrait of McIlwain encapsulates many of the qualities of Osborne's painting, regardless of genre or subject. Exemplary drawing, an understanding of light and skilled management of colour, and to return to where we started, a marked humanity and sensitivity to character. It also has a very nice dog in it, of which his father would have been proud. In light of what we have seen this evening, I hope it's appropriate to conclude with a hybrid picture, and indeed it's the painting that the exhibition ends with upstairs. It's part portrait, part scene of everyday life. Tea in the Garden, which was left unfinished at Osborne's death in 1903, is set in the back garden of 5 Castlewood Avenue, the epicenter of Osborne's family life. And it features members of the Crawford family who live next door, as well as the artist's own relatives. Children sit on the grass, rather appropriately given how many we see in his paintings, while visible on the bench in the background is the spectral figure of an elderly woman, probably Osborne's mother, Annie Jane. Their presence testifies to Osborne's lingering or enduring appetite for juxtaposing youth and old age, and his steadfast connection to friends and family. Finally, it seems apt to note that Osborne's great friend Walter Osborne, whose portrait we've just seen, was convinced that this picture in particular would appeal to an American audience. It's very sketchy, he explained to Hugh Lane, but very brilliant. And I hope that has been your experience of the exhibition and his work as well. So thank you very much.
Back to them.
We have a microphone too.
Oh, should I repeat? Anyway, the position of children with their backs versus the more stage-like quality that maybe came a bit before them. Do you think photography had any influence on that kind of looking at the figures?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think photography had a huge influence on these paintings generally. It's funny, when we think about it now, it might seem as if working from photography was a slavish thing to do. It was, like a cheat, because but at the time, photography was an innovative technology, a new technology, or relatively new technology, but it also had distinct limitations. So what artists were able to do was take certain things from them, like that notion of the snapshot, where people would not be orientated as conventionally they would have been in painting, but also would be able to apply color or make amendments to the change perspective, which Osborne did many times. But I think you're absolutely right. It is that sense of the snapshot which was captured by photography in a way that hadn't been the case traditionally in painting, because everything was so orchestrated and choreographed, if you like. So I think you're completely right. And we know that Osborne not only used photography, but also took photographs as well, and he was not alone by any means. Thomas Eakins, who I mentioned, used photography routinely, all the time, both in the creation of his backdrops, but also in the modeling of figures as well.
I'm wondering whether it's just my imagination or whatever, but that one picture that really, or portrait that really, or scene, I guess, that really struck me was October morning, and it just seemed like it was an incredible 3D kind of sense about it that I didn't quite detect in others. But I mean, I was just kind of amazed by it.
That too was a product of photography, actually. One of the things that early photography, and this wasn't even early photography has been around since the 1840s, but photography in the 1880s really struggled with
middle ground. The depth of field was very shallow, so it actually throws the figures in the foreground into relief. So I don't know if you've ever seen daguerreotype photographs that were seen through a double viewer. So you had two images and you needed a special contraption to see them. These were early photographs. And the favored subjects were things like grand landscapes. And they were 3D in a way that later became a bit of a novelty. But at the time, it was a way of actually having 3D images that were photographs that you needed a particular set of viewers to see. And they were very familiar with photography. So in a way, it's highly likely that for a lot of these pictures, Osborne was working directly from photographs and amending them in the studio or amending the compositions. So what you see is not in your imagination at all. It's absolutely consistent with what naturalist painters of this kind were producing.
Yeah, I'm just amazed at the technique used to do that.
Well, actually, you know, one of the things, sometimes when these works are reproduced in black and white, they look like photographs, much more so when they're in color, almost to the point that they're indistinguishable from photographs. It's remarkable, and that really is consistent with what you say.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. The last point that you left off with had to do with tea in the garden. And you were just speaking about photography and naturalism and how they look so much like photographs. But then you mentioned this kind of sketchy style. So do we see like an evolution towards, I guess, a more kind of painterly style with looser brushstrokes? And
that's exactly what it was, I think. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. It's more impressionistic. He was no impressionist, but it's more impressionistic. He would have been familiar with impressionist painting, and he wasn't alone. I mean, these are good examples. You see his signature in the bottom left on the right-hand side. The bottom left of that picture on the right-hand side is in these blocked letters. All these painters, these followers of Bastien Lepage, or almost all of them, Cheryl will know many of them, signed in that way with these very deliberate square letters, and then got to the end of the 1890s and decided that or even earlier, and decided that it was no longer fashionable to do it, and they changed their signatures. I know lots of artists who did it. Osborne did it. So you'll see upstairs that his signature suddenly changes into this much more fluid, script-like signature. So it was a very deliberate decision to loosen everything and make it all a bit freer and more, more loose and in terms of the technique. Very deliberate and does attempt to achieve something different in capturing fleeting effects of light, principally. These pictures are what you'd, I suppose, describe as tonal. People often talk about the grayish tonality to them. So artists weren't so concerned with pure color or the expressive potential of color. It was all about even tone. But by the time he painted that later picture, he'd moved on from that.
And did you mention that he was planning to exhibit it in the United States? Did you say that?
Well, he had, no, this was in relation to an exhibition that Hugh Lane was putting together for the United States. So it wasn't for an American audience, but one particular person recognized it as being of a kind that would appeal in America, because of course Americans were collecting Impressionist work vigorously at the time. So you can understand why that might have been the case.
Thank you so much. Oh.
Okay, this is just a curious detail. One of the first actual portraits of Osborne that you showed, the formal one with his palette, it was by an anonymous painter. I just can't believe, after all the research on this man, and it's not like it's 500 years ago, why we don't know who painted that.
Well, this is a formal photograph rather than a painting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So we know who the gentleman, this is the gentleman in the background we can identify, but it's a photograph. These are both photographs, and it was a standard studio photograph.
Okay, that makes more sense then. I thought it was painted.
Well, no, actually, this one is in the National Library, and in Dublin, and there may be some evidence of the photographic firm that took it.
Oh. Yeah,
You'd
okay.
sometimes have a record of that, but you wouldn't necessarily have a record of the individual photographer.
That's more understandable, thank you, okay.
So Guinness and Jamison and Faulkner, are these all the names we know of? I mean, the famous people?
These were prominent. In the case of the Guinnesses, that was the Guinness, the legal branch of the family rather than the brewing branch, but they were all interrelated.
Okay.
But Osborne's sitters generally were drawn from the high professions, so the legal profession, few military people, the clerical profession. He did quite a lot of bishops and senior clerics. And they were, of course, the people who at the time were investing in portraiture in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. But yeah, we know who they are.
They're the famous ones that we all know, like the writer, related to the brewery, related to the distillery.
Yeah.
So I have actually two questions for you. One of them is, I'm always struck when I look at some of these images of like people in the fields or plowing. Who is the audience for those kinds of paintings? That's one question. And then secondly, we frequently talk about how Osborne is a naturalist and how he's not moralizing, and certainly I understand that, but when you look at things like the boy blowing bubbles and even the girls playing with the house of cards, that is so Chardin, that is so 18th century French, moralism going on there. And I just wonder, is there any connection back to the 18th century? Like what is his relationship to the message that art can send?
Oh, wow. How long have we got left? To answer the first question about who he painted them for, it is interesting there were so many paintings left in his studio when he died. A lot of them he painted for himself. I think he pleased himself. And that was sort of his background, because that is what he'd done. He traveled quite a lot in England and in France before that. But there was an increasing appetite among mid-level collectors for works of this kind, these domestic pictures that would embellish your house. So these weren't grand pictorial statements. They were fairly modest, fairly modestly priced. It was his portraits that were so expensive. But of course, as we know, partly through necessity and expediency, he gravitated towards the much more lucrative business of painting portraits for people. So, and tightened his work and tailored his work with those in mind. As regards how much he was informed by 18th century work, I think one of the things that Katie expanded upon was how receptive he was to influences in recent art and in his contemporaries. I think that was definitely true. He was a learned artist, as so many artists were. As to how connected he felt with the tradition of portrait painting, I'm not sure. The reason I described that little picture of the boy blowing bubbles as matter of fact is that it's so clearly taking place in his studio. He's made no attempt to disguise where it's happening. So there's no placement of, whereas Millet's, which is nearly contemporaneous with that, is this kind of confection of influences. It's trying to be lots of things at once, and of course it served a commercial purpose on top of that. But it tries to do nothing apart from appeal to your sentiment and your sense of that sort of mawkishness. Whereas Osborne seems to be about the child and the child's experience. But I completely take your point about Chardin, but then Chardin had the same quality, didn't he, in terms of trying to make these penetrations into character. Millet less so. So I think you're probably right. As to consciously how aware he was of it, I don't know. I mean, the form that portraits took was very well established. And curiously, Osborne normally painted people sitting down because he preferred to, but always in a particular way.
that had been learnt from portraits that he knew in the past, and of course portraits that his patrons knew, so they knew how they wanted to be presented. But there's probably an awful lot to unpick in your question, and I've done an appalling job of trying to handle it. But no, there's a lot to be looked at there. Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice?
Anybody else? Once, going twice? All right, thank you all.